January 1945. The frost of the Ardennes forest gnaws at the exposed skin of the soldiers huddled in the trenches. The once quiet woods are now a chaotic cacophony. The crack of distant artillery, the whistle of mortars, and the thud of gunfire filling the air. The air smells of gunpowder, blood, and the damp, earthy scent of winter's cold grasp. Soldiers from both sides, weary and desperate, huddle in their foxholes, staring across the no-man's land that stretches between them. Among them, medics move with calm purpose, their uniforms stained and heavy with the grime of battle. Amid the destruction, they are the only ones who hold the power to save lives. But this battlefield is different. Here, under the shadow of the German offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge, the lines blur. In a rare and surreal moment, an American medic kneels beside a German soldier, bloodied and broken, and begins the quiet work of saving him. A German medic watches in silence, his own hands trembling from the weight of a choice he never thought he would have to make: to help the enemy. In the midst of an all-consuming war, where every moment feels like life or death, these medics, sworn enemies just moments ago, share something deeper: a flicker of humanity, a bond forged not by ideology, but by the universal need to save a life. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the coldest and deadliest periods of World War II. On the Western Front, the Allies had successfully invaded Normandy in June 1944. But despite their advances, the war was far from over. By the end of 1944, the Allies found themselves locked in a brutal battle to break through German defenses, pushing deeper into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The German army, though battered and broken, was far from defeated. The war's fate seemed undecided as it teetered between final victory and desperate resistance. The United States had established a formidable presence in Western Europe, with soldiers, tanks, and artillery slowly grinding their way through German-held territory. Yet the Germans had not given up. The Battle of the Bulge, fought in the Ardennes forest during December 1944 and January 1945, was a desperate attempt by Adolf Hitler's forces to turn the tide of the war. In what would become one of the last major German offensives of the war, the Wehrmacht launched a surprise attack against the Allies, hoping to disrupt their supply lines and regain the initiative. It was a brutal offensive. Snow-covered fields, thick fog, and heavy artillery made it an unforgiving environment for all involved. The Americans were not the only ones fighting in the snow and mud of the Ardennes. The Germans, too, were facing a brutal winter. Their supplies were dwindling, their morale was low, and the prospect of a looming defeat was heavy in the air. Both sides were exhausted, their soldiers weathered and scarred by years of endless conflict. By January 1945, with both sides entrenched in bloody stalemate, the lines between life and death had grown razor-thin. Yet, amidst the cold and carnage, another, unexpected force was at work: the medics. Medics, whether American or German, had one mission: to save lives. Despite being surrounded by death and destruction, they worked tirelessly in conditions that would break the strongest of men. Their presence was a testament to the strength of humanity, even on a battlefield where humanity often seemed in short supply. While soldiers fought for supremacy and power, medics fought for life, struggling to keep their comrades alive, no matter the cost. But their role extended beyond merely tending to wounds. They faced a dilemma that was far from black and white. When a medic treated a soldier, they did so without discrimination, whether that soldier wore the uniform of the Third Reich or the stars and stripes of the United States. As the war neared its final phase, the Allies were increasingly taking ground in Europe, while the Germans were retreating into their homeland. The killing fields were ever present, but the respect for medical personnel remained steadfast on both sides. Under the Geneva Conventions, medics had immunity, not because of their allegiance, but because of their commitment to the preservation of life. This was true even for those on opposing sides, a rare moment of humanity in the brutality of war. The medical tents, field hospitals, and aid stations became neutral zones where the lines of war seemed to disappear, if only for a fleeting moment. The Battle of the Bulge, beginning on December 16, 1944, was a ferocious test of endurance for both sides. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, the Germans launched their surprise offensive against the Allied forces, pushing through American lines with the intent of recapturing Antwerp and splitting the Allied forces. What followed was a grueling month-long engagement that would become one of the bloodiest and most costly battles in the entire war. As the Allies scrambled to reinforce their positions, the conflict descended into brutal close-quarters fighting in freezing temperatures. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite, exhaustion, and injuries from constant artillery barrages. The battlefield was a grotesque tableau of death. Bodies frozen in the snow, the remnants of shattered vehicles and weapons scattered across the fields. Under these conditions, medics from both the American and German armies were thrust into an unimaginable situation. Working in the heart of combat zones, they had to perform field triage, prioritize the wounded, and administer treatment without the luxury of time or resources. American medics, many of whom were drafted from civilian life, had little training beyond basic first aid. Yet they were expected to save lives, stabilize the wounded, and move them to rear-area hospitals under constant threat from enemy fire. Their job was a life-or-death race against time. German medics, too, faced the same dilemmas. Their army, already strained by years of warfare, was also ill-equipped to deal with the massive influx of casualties. In this bleak and unforgiving setting, medics from both sides were often forced into situations where they had to make decisions that transcended the battle lines. In the chaos of the battlefield, the wounded did not wear the same uniforms, nor did they carry the same ideological burdens. They were simply human beings, broken and in need of help. And so, while soldiers on both sides continued their combat, the medics, even in the midst of this horrific fighting, found themselves cooperating in ways that went beyond duty. These moments, though brief and rare, created a shared bond between those who were supposed to be enemies. They worked side by side, often with nothing but the shared goal of saving lives. Such cooperation was not without its risks. Treating an enemy soldier could invite suspicion or even retaliation. The battlefield code that separated enemies from allies had little room for mercy. And yet, in this small pocket of humanity, where the rules of war seemed to bend, medics found themselves bound not by national allegiance, but by the universal bond of compassion. The act of saving an enemy soldier, even momentarily, was a silent but powerful rebellion against the cruelty of war. For the medics, war was not fought in the fields of strategy or politics. It was fought in the mud of the trenches, the blood-soaked earth of the battlefield, where every life mattered, even those who wore the enemy's uniform. For American medic Private First Class Charles Baker, the war had become a test of his own humanity. Only 22, Baker had been drafted into the U.S. Army after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and, like many young men, he had joined the fight with the hope of defending his country. But after months on the front lines in France and Belgium, the reality of war had begun to wear him down. By January 1945, during the thick of the Battle of the Bulge, Baker was no longer concerned with grand strategy or political ideologies. His focus was survival, both for himself and for the men under his care. The sight of his fellow soldiers, brothers in arms, bleeding out on the battlefield, calling out for help, had changed him. He had seen young men die in horrific ways, with nothing but a moment of pain and fear before they were gone. But Baker's role was different from the soldiers around him. He was a medic, sworn to save lives no matter the cost. Then, in the thick of a snowstorm that clouded vision and dampened hope, Baker found himself beside a German soldier, lying unconscious in the snow. The man had been shot through the chest. a wound that would surely be fatal if left untreated. There was no hesitation. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a human being, a soldier in need. Baker worked quickly, applying a makeshift bandage to stem the blood flow, his hands numb from the cold. The war felt distant in these moments when life itself was the only thing that mattered. Across the battlefield, German medic Hans Müller, a man in his late 30s, faced his own internal struggle. He had been a medic for years, a man whose duty was to save lives, even if those lives were the enemy's. Müller had treated many Allied soldiers, some of whom had been captured during earlier engagements, and in every case, he felt the same dilemma. As a German soldier, he was expected to treat wounded soldiers according to the Geneva Conventions, but it was difficult to ignore the hatred he had for the enemy. His commitment to saving lives, however, had remained steadfast. Yet, when the time came to treat an American soldier, the decision wasn't so easy. Müller knelt over a U.S. soldier, his heart pounding. It was an unfamiliar face, but the desperation was the same. The American soldier's leg had been shredded by shrapnel, and Müller could hear his ragged breathing as he tried to control the panic. This was a moment of deep contradiction for Müller. He had been trained to despise the Americans, but in this moment, they were simply soldiers, just like him. For a moment, the chaos of the battlefield disappeared as Müller and the soldier shared a fleeting moment of understanding, a brief exchange of glances that spoke volumes without a word being spoken. They were both medics. They were both trying to save lives. War, particularly on the front lines, is a series of tactical decisions made under extreme pressure. For medics, those decisions were as life-altering as any made by commanding officers. Unlike combatants who fought with rifles and tanks, medics fought with their knowledge and tools, their ability to save lives often determining the difference between survival and death. They had to perform triage under the most stressful conditions, evaluating who could be saved and who would perish, often with only seconds to make those decisions. On the battlefield, medics had to move fast. The enemy was relentless, and the sound of gunfire never stopped. But medics worked in a world apart from the rest of the soldiers. They were not there to fight, but to heal. As one of the first lines of defense in an army's medical structure, their role was to stabilize soldiers and evacuate them to field hospitals or rear units. Yet, the resources at their disposal were often limited, especially in winter campaigns like the Battle of the Bulge, where snowstorms reduced visibility and the supply lines had been severed. During these critical moments, medics had to make harrowing decisions. When a soldier was beyond help, they often had to prioritize those whose injuries were survivable, giving them the limited supplies, morphine, bandages, splints, that could make the difference. But even in these dire situations, they had a duty to save everyone, regardless of allegiance. One of the most remarkable aspects of these medical operations was the fact that medics from both sides would occasionally work together in the midst of battle. In rare moments of peace, such as after a firefight or during a lull, both American and German medics found themselves collaborating on triage efforts. It wasn't uncommon for American medics to work alongside German medics, exchanging equipment, bandages, and even offering advice on how to treat certain wounds. The tools they used were simple: field kits filled with gauze, antiseptics, and the occasional surgical instrument. But they were effective. For the medics, it wasn't about who wore which uniform, it was about who could be saved. While soldiers clashed with weapons of war, the medics were fighting their own battle, one that required knowledge, innovation, and resourcefulness. Field hospitals and medical kits, though rudimentary by today's standards, were crucial to the survival of wounded soldiers. In the freezing conditions of the Ardennes, medical personnel worked with whatever they had on hand, often improvising in ways that could save lives. Both the American and German medics had access to similar technologies: stretchers, field dressings, syringes, and rudimentary antibiotics. But beyond that, each side also had their own methods for improvising treatments. For instance, when medical supplies ran out, American medics would often rely on makeshift bandages made from anything they could find, pieces of cloth, torn uniforms, or even personal items like scarves. Similarly, German medics would sometimes use unconventional materials to treat wounds, such as gauze fashioned from socks or torn jackets. Both sides had developed innovative ways to treat the trauma caused by war. On the American side, the use of penicillin was already making a significant impact on treating infections. German medics, though lacking access to large quantities of antibiotics, often relied on advanced surgical procedures, particularly when it came to treating shrapnel wounds, which were common in the dense forests of the Ardennes. Despite the key differences in available supplies, both groups shared one common objective: to save as many lives as possible, often at great personal risk. Leadership on both the American and German sides had a significant influence on how medics treated enemy casualties. As the war intensified and the combat grew more brutal, the higher command's stance on the treatment of wounded soldiers, especially enemy soldiers, became a point of contention. While battlefield medics remained committed to their mission of saving lives, the officers often had more rigid views, shaped by military strategy and political ideology. For American commanders, the Geneva Conventions offered clear guidelines on how to treat enemy soldiers who were incapacitated, though not all officers adhered to these guidelines in practice. Medics, however, followed the rules more closely. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, issued orders to treat prisoners of war humanely, it set the tone for the American approach. However, this directive did not necessarily apply across the board, and some commanders were more focused on gaining ground than on humanitarian efforts. On the German side, Hitler's regime had its own orders when it came to dealing with enemy prisoners and casualties. German soldiers were often encouraged to view their foes not as humans, but as subhuman, an extension of Nazi ideology that sought to dehumanize the Allied forces. However, German medics, bound by their own professional ethics, were often caught in the conflict between following orders and adhering to the tenets of the Geneva Conventions, which their military officially signed. As the war wore on, particularly during the winter of 1944-45, German commanders grew desperate, and any semblance of mercy or compassion often took a back seat to survival. Still, many medics, in spite of the harsh climate, tried to honor their oaths, treating Allied soldiers alongside their own. The story of collaboration between enemy medics often came down to individual choice, a choice to prioritize human life over enemy lines. These medics faced immense pressure, not only from their own superiors, but from the brutality of the war itself. Yet, many chose to continue their work with a sense of professionalism, grounded in the understanding that the need for care transcended the boundaries of nationality and allegiance. In the brutal conditions of the battlefield, where ideology and political motivations often fueled the fire of conflict, the simple act of saving an enemy soldier posed a profound moral question. Medics, who were sworn to uphold the sanctity of life, found themselves torn between their duty to save lives and the reality of the war they were fighting. For American medics, there was little debate about the ethics of treating enemy soldiers. They followed the Geneva Conventions, which stated that the wounded, regardless of nationality, must be given care. But that was the official stance. At a personal level, many medics struggled with the idea of treating soldiers they had been taught to hate, men they had been trained to see as the embodiment of evil. It was one thing to treat an enemy combatant when it was a matter of triage, when survival depended on quick action. But in moments where medics had time to think, the moral question arose: could they really save someone who, just moments ago, had been trying to kill them? In many ways, This was the most poignant aspect of battlefield medicine. In the heat of combat, soldiers were simply soldiers, human beings who bled the same red blood, who experienced pain, fear, and death. But when the adrenaline of battle faded, when the wounded were left in the hands of medics, that humanity could no longer be ignored. For some medics, the act of saving an enemy soldier was not just a duty, but a moral imperative, a small act of defiance against the dehumanizing forces of war. For German medics like Hans Müller, the act of treating an American soldier went beyond professional ethics. It was an act of compassion, one that reflected his deep internal conflict. Having been trained in the Nazi ideology that viewed Jews, Slavs, and others as less than human, Müller struggled with the idea of treating enemy combatants as equals. Yet, as a medic, he could not deny the universal truth of suffering. The American soldier he helped that day had been just that. A soldier, a human being caught in the same devastating circumstances. To save him was not a political act, but a humane one. The most striking element of the medics' cooperation was the recognition of shared humanity. In the midst of the overwhelming chaos of war, when soldiers saw each other only as enemies, the medics found something more universal. They recognized, in each other, the shared burden of tending to the wounded. For both U.S. and German soldiers, the war had been a relentless cycle of violence, where the enemy was dehumanized. Yet, for the medics, the wounds were always human. No matter who caused them, they witnessed firsthand the grotesque consequences of war, and in those rare moments of cooperation, they were able to see the face of the enemy not as a combatant, but as another person, caught in the same tragic situation. One American medic, Lieutenant James Evans, recalled an experience during the Battle of the Bulge, when he was forced to work alongside a German medic, after both sides had suffered heavy casualties. As Evans treated the wounded, a German medic approached and offered to help. There was an initial hesitation as the two men stood across from each other, wary of the other's intentions. Yet as they worked side by side, their shared dedication to their mission, to save lives, became the only thing that mattered. Evans would later write in a letter to his family that this experience changed his view of the war. I had been fighting a faceless enemy, but in those moments, I saw him as a man, just like me. In the quiet of the battlefield, amidst the stench of death and the roar of artillery, a fleeting bond was formed, one that transcended the divisions of nationality, politics, and ideology. It was a momentary act of humanity in a world where such acts were rare, and it served as a testament to the idea that, even in war, there are moments where we are all simply human. The moment arrived in the heart of the Battle of the Bulge, on a snow-choked stretch of ground where the roar of artillery had drowned out all but the most desperate cries. The battlefield was a bleak, frozen expanse. German forces, emboldened by their surprise offensive, had caught the Allies off guard, pushing the Americans into retreat. Yet even as the U.S. Army fought desperately to hold the line, there was an unexpected scene unfolding in the midst of the chaos. Medics, both American and German, working together in the cold, trying to save lives amid the brutal backdrop of war. In a small clearing near a destroyed tank, an American medic, Private First Class Charles Baker, crouched beside a German soldier who had been grievously injured in the crossfire. The man was barely conscious, his breath shallow and labored, the blood staining the snow beneath him. Baker's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision he had to make. In the span of his short military career, he had treated countless Americans, but this was the first time he had been forced to help the enemy in such a direct way. Baker didn't hesitate. His training had prepared him for moments like this, when a life, any life, could hang in the balance. The wounds on the German soldier were severe, a shrapnel wound to the leg that had severed an artery. Baker worked quickly, using the meager supplies available to stop the bleeding, his fingers numb from the cold. As he worked, Another figure appeared through the fog of war, a German medic, Hans Müller, who had been treating American soldiers on the other side of the clearing. The two men locked eyes. There was a brief moment of silence, a pause in the madness of battle. Müller, his uniform bloodied from tending to his own wounded comrades, approached without speaking. In that moment, there were no words needed. They both understood the urgency of the situation. The soldier before them needed help, and they were the only ones who could provide it. Without hesitation, Müller stepped forward, offering his own supplies, a syringe of morphine, which Baker accepted with a nod of gratitude. The two medics worked together, side by side, as if they had known each other for years. Their movements were fluid, synchronized, a shared rhythm born out of necessity. Despite the violence surrounding them, despite the war that raged on just a few hundred yards away, they focused solely on their task. The German soldier's life was hanging by a thread, but for those few moments, the medics were united in a singular goal: to save him. This cooperation between enemy medics was a rare occurrence in World War II, and it became a defining moment for both men. For Baker, it was a realization that the enemy he had been taught to hate was just another man, fighting for his own survival. And for Müller, it was a recognition that, despite their uniforms, they were not so different after all. In the midst of all the bloodshed and hatred, the two medics shared something more fundamental: the instinct to preserve life. The decision to cooperate, even in the face of imminent danger, would not be without consequences. But in that brief moment, the walls of animosity and fear seemed to fall away. What remained was a simple truth: that in war, even amidst the worst of humanity, there can still be moments of compassion and understanding. The moment of cooperation between the two medics did not go unnoticed. As they finished treating the wounded German soldier, they were surrounded by the stark realities of the battlefield. More men, both American and German, were being brought in, some dead, some clinging to life. Yet, in that fleeting moment, the medics had crossed a line that was impossible to erase. For Baker and Müller, the war had momentarily faded into the background, and the shared humanity between them had become undeniable. In the hours that followed, the battlefield continued its brutal march, indifferent to the lives of those who fought upon it. But for those medics, the psychological impact of what had occurred would remain long after the battle ended. Baker later spoke of how this moment changed his perception of the war. The soldier he had saved, a man who had been his enemy, never spoke a word of gratitude. In fact, he didn't even survive the night. But for Baker, the experience was not about the outcome. It was about the act itself. It was about realizing that no matter what side someone fought for, they were all ultimately human. Similarly, Müller, in his reflections after the war, described the incident as a moment that broke the ideological barriers he had long carried. The war had been brutal, and it had taught him many things, not least the value of life. But that moment on the battlefield, when he and an enemy medic worked together to save a soldier from both their armies, was one that stayed with him long after the guns had stopped firing. The war had dehumanized both sides, but in those few minutes of cooperation, Müller saw the possibility of something else, something that transcended the uniforms, the politics, and the bloodshed. For both medics, it was a quiet realization that they were not just part of an army, part of a system of war, but human beings with the same desires to survive, to help, and to make a difference in the face of unimaginable suffering. The battlefield, for them, had become a place of both horror and fleeting humanity, where even enemies could share the burden of care. The act of cooperation, though brief, marked a shift in their perceptions of the war. They were no longer simply soldiers on opposing sides. They were medics, bound by a shared commitment to preserve life, even at the cost of their own. This rare moment of compassion, however, was not the norm in the war. Most soldiers, even medics, viewed the enemy through a lens of hostility, where survival meant defeating the other side. But these few brief moments of cooperation, when soldiers put aside their differences to save lives, painted a powerful image of humanity amidst the destruction of war. The Battle of the Bulge would go down in history as one of the most brutal and costly engagements of World War II, a final desperate push by the Germans to halt the Allied advance. By the time the battle drew to a close in January 1945, the Americans had suffered over 89,000 casualties, including over 19,000 dead, while the Germans faced approximately 100,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead. In the aftermath of such destruction, the lives of those who had participated in the battle, especially those on the front lines, seemed insignificant in the grand narrative of war. Yet, for the medics who had labored in the trenches and field hospitals, the emotional and psychological impact of their work would stay with them long after the conflict ended. For Charles Baker and Hans Müller, the aftermath was not one of grand celebrations or immediate relief. The realities of war, the fear, the bloodshed, and the devastating toll on human life were ever present. The soldier that Baker had worked so hard to save, the German soldier whose wounds were so severe, died shortly after the treatment. The futility of the situation was overwhelming. Even when medics worked together, even when lives were saved in the moment, the war ground on mercilessly. Baker would later write in a letter to his family, "We did what we could, but it doesn't seem to matter much in the end. The men are dying by the thousands, and we are just one small piece of this God-forsaken thing." Müller, too, had a similar experience. Though he continued to work in the medical corps for the duration of the war, the faces of the men he treated, the soldiers who never had a chance, haunted him. He had seen men he once viewed as enemies as fellow human beings, just as vulnerable, just as afraid. The fleeting cooperation between him and Baker marked a point of change in his understanding of the war. Yet, as the battle ended and the German forces retreated, Müller was left with the heavy weight of his country's defeat. In his reflections, he often mentioned how the war had become a personal tragedy, a conflict that had not only destroyed nations, but had torn apart the souls of those who fought in it. Both medics found that the aftermath of war left them scarred in ways they hadn't anticipated. Baker, once full of youthful idealism, was forever changed by the brutality he witnessed and the relationships he forged in the heat of battle. He was no longer a soldier fighting for a cause, he was a man, forever marked by the faces of the men he had saved and the ones he couldn't. Müller, too, struggled with the emotional toll of the war. His duty as a medic had forced him to confront the realities of conflict, and the fleeting moment of cooperation with Baker had become an indelible memory, one that would continue to shape his views on war, humanity, and compassion long after the final shot was fired. In the broader scope of history, however, the cooperation between these two men, while significant on a personal level, was largely ignored. The victory at the Battle of the Bulge was celebrated, and the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion. But for those who had fought in the trenches, for the medics who had treated the wounded from both sides, the aftermath was filled with a quiet reflection on the human cost of war, a reflection that went largely unnoticed in the history books. Though the Battle of the Bulge ended in the defeat of the German forces, the effects of the battle continued to echo through the lives of those who had fought and survived. For Charles Baker, the memories of his time as a medic in the war stayed with him for decades. The wounds of battle were not just physical, they were psychological. The camaraderie and bond he had shared with fellow soldiers, and even with enemy medics, were marks of the fleeting humanity that could exist amid the horrors of war. Yet, when the war ended, those fleeting moments were overshadowed by the larger narrative of victory and defeat. The personal connections forged in those brief, shared moments of compassion, like the moment when he worked alongside Hans Müller, were lost in the fog of history. For Hans Müller, the war had brought an even more profound internal reckoning. Though he had lived through the defeat of Germany and the collapse of the Nazi regime, the act of saving an American soldier and working alongside an American medic left a lasting impact. He had been a cog in the machine of a war that destroyed everything it touched. But in those quiet moments on the battlefield, he had seen something different. The recognition that soldiers on both sides of the conflict were more than just pawns in a political struggle, that they were men, driven by fear and survival, had fundamentally altered his perception of the war. After the war ended, Müller returned to civilian life in a broken and divided Germany. He carried with him the scars of war, but he also carried something else, a quiet hope that humanity could still find a way to rise above the darkness of conflict. He would never forget the brief moment of cooperation with the American medic, and the shared recognition that, despite the uniforms they wore, they were both simply men trying to save lives. As for the broader historical narrative, the cooperation between enemy medics remained an unspoken part of the war. The war's great battles, the rise and fall of nations, the political machinations, these were the stories that filled the pages of history. But the quiet, unsung acts of humanity that occurred in the trenches, the moments when soldiers worked together to heal one another, were often overlooked. Yet, for those who experienced them, those moments held a quiet power. They served as a reminder that even in the worst of times, even amidst the most horrific violence, the bonds of compassion and humanity could still transcend the hatred of war. In the end, the cooperation between U.S. and German medics in the middle of a brutal battle may not have changed the course of the war. It may not have altered the outcome of the conflict, but for those few moments, as the bullets flew and the snow fell, a fleeting sense of shared humanity emerged. A moment of kindness amidst a storm of destruction. And that moment, no matter how small, was a testament to the possibility of hope and compassion even in the darkest of times. The Battle of the Bulge, like so many moments in the vast theater of World War II, was a brutal clash of ideologies, strategies, and sheer willpower. The war was defined by an overwhelming sense of division, not just between nations, but within the hearts of the men who fought in it. Yet, as the story of the American and German medics proves, there were instances where this divide was bridged, if only momentarily, by a deeper, universal bond, the will to preserve life. For the soldiers, the medics, the officers, and the men on the front lines, the war was a never-ending push toward survival. But for those who operated in the shadows of combat, those whose job it was to treat the wounded, the war was also about something more, a quiet defiance against the cruelty that surrounded them. The cooperation between Charles Baker and Hans Müller was not the defining moment of the Battle of the Bulge, nor was it the turning point of the war. But it stands as a powerful reminder that, even in the most harrowing of circumstances, moments of human connection can emerge from the chaos. War is often painted in broad strokes, victories and losses, heroism and villainy. But what lies beneath these grand narratives are the smaller, more intimate stories that shape the lives of those involved. It is in these moments, the brief interactions between enemy soldiers, the fleeting cooperation between enemy medics, where the true cost of war becomes apparent. For Baker and Müller, the war didn't just change their countries, it changed them. The bonds they forged, however temporary, served as a reminder that, in the end, all men are driven by similar fears, desires, and hopes. What makes this story significant is not the act of saving one soldier, but what that act represents: a spark of compassion in a world gone mad with violence. In a war where ideologies and political allegiances often took precedence over the value of human life, the medics were the ones who reminded us of our shared humanity. They didn't see the uniform, the nationality, or the enemy. They saw a man in need of help. In doing so, they revealed something that war had long sought to extinguish: the possibility of empathy, even in the most unimaginable of circumstances. The legacy of such moments, though often forgotten by history, echoes through the generations. It serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity for compassion in the most dire of situations, even in war. Perhaps, especially in war. There are moments when the walls of hatred and division break down, if only for an instant. And it is in those moments that we are reminded of what it means to be human.